James chapter 5. James chapter 5. Good to see everybody this morning. I know I didn't get around and say hi to everybody. I'll do that after class. It's good to have everybody here with us. We'll be in James 5 talking about prayer this morning. And the prayer really part is at the end, but it goes with everything at the beginning to kind of explain why James does it the way he does. Before we do that, as we do every class period, let's go ahead and jump to our questions real quick. Come to those and go over them. All right, first question, Joshua 22. How did Joshua say the Israelites living on both the east and west side of the Jordan would be rewarded for obeying God?
They kept his commandments. They was told what to do, and they done it by Moses and then by God, and they never left the people, so they did what God said to do.
Exactly. They did everything that God said to do, as he said the reward of obeying. He said if you go on both sides of it, he goes, you'd have rest. Complete rest. Everything, nothing would, in other words, wars would stop for a while. We know it wouldn't stop for good, but it stopped for a little while. They'd have that rest. Exactly. Let's go to the next one. John 4. Jesus told the Samaritan lady that God is A, spirit, B, flesh and bones, or C, of the imagination. No one say C, please. All right, that's right. A of the spirit. Next one. Describe Jesus's healing of the nobleman's son. So basically, what did the nobleman wanted Jesus to go back? And what did Jesus say?
He said, go, and your son will live.
Your son will live. So Jesus said basically he wasn't going to go, but he told the man to go home. And then when the man got home, what did he do with those who were taking care of his son? What did he ask them? Anybody remember? He asked him at what time did it take place that he was healed, and it was the exact time when Jesus had told him that he would be healed. And so we see that remarkable, amazing feat there, and that brings the nobleman, of course, believing who Christ is without a doubt. He'd already done, but I mean, imagine what much more that faith made him. The next question is, the implanted blank is able to save your souls. James 1:21. The implanted word, exactly right. Next question, faith without works is dead. James 2:17, verse 20, and also verse 26. Next one. An Old Testament Bible character who was called the friend of God in James 2:23 was who? Abraham, exactly. It was Abraham. And then James 3, in discussing man's tongue, James does not mention of A, bits in a horse's mouth, B, pigs wallowing in the mud, C, rudders on ships, or D, forest fires. B, pigs wallowing in the mud. Yeah, I hope that had nothing to do with that. I don't want to taste any mud. Had a mud pie before, that was a mistake. All right, you don't want a kid. Yes or no? From the same mouth can both blessings and cursings come forth. They can, but it's not, God doesn't want that to happen. Exactly right. I mean, we know without a doubt that He can do it, and it happens all the time. But that's where He says, is God pleased with both? No, not at all. He wants those praises, those blessings that come out of our mouths to others. The next one, the source of wars and fights is what? It talks about the desires of ourselves. Exactly right. The desires within us that come from within. Next and last one, James compares the length of life here on earth to a what? James 4:14. To a vapor, exactly right. We know vapor comes and it goes away. And it's so quick, and so that's exactly right. All right, James 5. James 5, the prayer, as we look at it, as we know, we live in a desperately we live in a world that is desperately, I guess you say, searching for power all the time. People seek power through political influence, financial wealth, social status, technology advancement, and so on. In fact, right now, we know the world is in a race for AI to see who gets it first. Basically, the way it looks like, whoever gets AI first completely is going to be ruling the world. I mean, that's what it sounds like, it's what it looks like. It's just remarkable, but it's kind of crazy at the same time, kind of scary with everything that's there. But that's what people search for. They search for, we want power. We want power over everything. We see that in different countries and so on. Yet the history of the church reveals something different to us. It reveals that the greatest power available to humanity does not originate here on earth. Does not originate with human beings. It originates originates in heaven and is accessed in our prayers to God. He says to pray to Him. That's where we find that power, the strength. And we know the power is found in the gospel, as Paul says in Romans chapter 1, 16 and 17. So today, as we think about diving into this final chapter of the letter of James, this letter is famously practical. We've talked about that. If you want to know how to be a good Christian, a better Christian, go to James. James is so easy to read, and it's so practical, and everyday things that go on in our life, you see it in there, and you see it involved, and we can pull it over to us. We know that James does not allow us to keep our faith in the realm of what we would call, secrecy. Basically, or just teachings of God. Abstract theology is what people call that. There's a teaching that's there. It has to go beyond that. And that's where we see the actions and the works that are involved in us. He demands our faith to work, and through our hands, through our tongues, through our writings, through our daily choices. As he closes this intense, hard-hitting letter, it really is a hard-hitting letter. He's like bam, 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 just going through each point. As you find it, bullet points, you would say. He anchors everything, though. Everything anchors down into this one very, very, very important topic, and that's communication. Communication can break or make a family, break or make a relationship, and the same thing comes with God. We see that you and I as Christians today, if we are not communicating with God, there is an absence there. There's a problem. So we always want to be doing it. If we're doing it, that's great. We continue to do it in the way He would have us. So as we think about this, James 5 presents us with the comprehensive, bringing everything together, the teachings on prayer, and it shows us that prayer is not a last resort for the helpless. Don't ever think that. That's not what it is. Should always be the first response for the righteous. Always the first response in everything we do. It is that kind of, we all know what atmospheric pressure does, especially if you have sinus problems or, other things. Everything changes. Someone has different things in their body, from a hip replacement, shoulder, elbow, whatever. All different, you can feel that in the pressure, the way it changes. So it sustains the Christian, through injustice, physical sickness, and national crisis, and even spiritual wandering, because that's what happens to Christians all the time. It's sad to say that, but hopefully they always come back to where they need to be with God. All right, so let's start this by talking about the cry of the oppressed. This is where James gets into verses 1 through 6, and I will say this, he's going to talk about the rich again, but here's the difference. Before he was talking about the rich of Christians, dealing inside the church. Now he's going to talk about the rich that are outside of the world and how they harm the church and the things that they can do to the church to break it down and what they were doing during this time while James was writing this in the first century. So let's go ahead and read this, verse 1 through 6. If someone read it for us, please.
Come now, you which weep and howl for your miseries that are coming unto you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you, and you will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasures in the last days. Indeed, the wages of the laborers you mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cried out, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your heart as in the day of the slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the most just. He does not resist you.
Thank you. So we see here that, James makes it very clear of how bad they were being treated by the rich people, what was going on here, what was taking place. James begins this chapter with a thunderous warning, really, to the wealthy who have built their empires on the backs of the poor. A thunderous warning, when you think of thunder, or lightning, you know what happens when lightning hits and then the thunder that comes behind it. I know yesterday, I think it was the day before yesterday, while we were moving Shannon, John, and the girls and doing stuff up, we got outside the vehicle, and all of a sudden, it was like right behind their house, crash! She was lightning going, and it shook the entire neighborhood, it felt like, And do you think it got her attention? Yeah, it got her attention, and that's what we see here with this, what he's saying. He goes, this is a thunderous, thing of what's happening. I need to get your attention. This is so important. So at first glance, when you look at this, this passage seems to be exclusively about social economics. So basically about the social society and the economics that are going on, the money that's being spent and so on, justice and financial ethics. However, notice the pivotal phrasing in verse 4, where he says, the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. And no, notice, that's not Sabbath. We got to understand, it's a little different here. We'll explain in a second. So the title, well, I'll just say it right now. The title used for Sabbath does not mean the Lord of the Sabbath day of rest. It's interesting. What it is, remember the terms we've seen, James. James has used military terms a lot throughout his letter. And he was just a man of the military. He understood it, and God inspired him things. And that's what this is. This is another military term of the calling the Lord of hosts or the Lord of armies. And so that's what that word really is there. So James is establishing a critical truth about the spiritual universe. So think about this. And the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts, or the Lord of armies, as you think about it in that sense. Even if there are if people are just too broken, say a prayer, and they suffer acts of intercession that basically enter directly into the courtroom of the commander of heaven's armies. What does he mean by that? Well, he's saying, even if you can't do it, if your heart is just hurting so bad, and you can't get the words out, guess what God knows? God knows what you're thinking. God knows what's going on. And he hears it. That's the thing about this that is so important. It teaches our first lesson about prayer in James 5, that God hears the unspoken cries of the hurting. When you're defrauded, when you're treated unjustly, when the human system failed to give you equity, you do not need to seek vengeance. That's what he's saying. He's saying your situation has already initiated a divine hearing with that of God and what would take place there. Think about the accumulation of the corrupt wealth that was during this time in the first century acts as a witness against the oppressor, while the silent agony of the faithful, acts as an appeal to the highest courts here. It hasn't changed today. There are rich people that are doing everything they can to run this world, to do whatever they can to move it in their direction. They care less about anybody else, just long as them and their family are taken care of. And that's a sad state of affair. That's a bad thing. But it's nothing new. That's what I want to get at. We think, why are they doing that today? It's always been like that in society. And we see that even back in the days of James. So James makes that very clear in the beginning of chapter 5, 1 through 6. Look, these people that are pressing you, don't worry about it. It's going to be taken care of. They are going to be taken care of if they don't get their act straight and live the way they're supposed to under God. So he does that and he moves on. So he moves on to talk about patient endurance. Remember, James is one of those things where it doesn't move smoothly. It's just like going one thing to the other as we see through it. And he does it all throughout the book, even here in chapter 5. So he refers to now about patient endurance and the coming judge that will be there. So because God hears our cries, our immediate response in times of waiting must be patient. It must be, let me rephrase that, must be patient endurance, anchored by a guarded tongue. In other words, hold on to our tongues. Make sure it's not saying what it shouldn't be saying. Let's see what he says. If someone will go and read those verses for us, please, 7 through 12.
Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruits of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no, no, lest you fall into judgment.
Thank you. So what James does here, he kind of shifts our understanding from the immediate pain of injustice to the ultimate great reward of Christ's return. That's what he's talking about. It's a reward for those who are with Christ, not a reward for those who aren't. And that's what he's showing us here. So he utilizes three distinct, basically, illustrations to model basically how we ought to carry ourselves while waiting for God to answer our prayers and right the world's wrongs. And so as you see this, each one of them makes so much sense. They're just so easy to understand. The first one, of course, is the farmer. It says he points to the farmer, basically, is what's happening here. Now, you think about a farmer for a moment. A farmer understands that there is a mandatory delay. Let me say it again. A mandatory delay between sowing and reaping, right? You don't go out there one day and you sow everything, and you go to bed, and you get up in the morning and you go, all right, woo, I'm going to go look at all my fruits, everything grew up, my vegetables and so on. It doesn't happen like that, does it? It doesn't happen the farmer can't do this. All right, you better grow as of tomorrow. You know, he can't force, you know, that crop to grow overnight or to grow the next day. It's just not going to happen. So he must depend entirely, especially if he doesn't have sprinkler system and everything there. What does he have to rely on? Who does he have to rely on? God. He relies on the rain to come down, you know, the early rains and later rains, you know, as we see that. And so important. This is the posture of a praying Christian. You know, I think it's funny, just the other day we were talking about, I'll just say it again, you know, Greg and a couple of others were back there speaking, we're talking about growing stuff, you know, in the garden we said, you know, we got a lot of rain for it, and they were like, you know, when rain comes, we're like, hey, rain, slow it down, and when we need rain, we pray for it, and guess what we got last couple of days? I mean, just crazy. So, you see that, so we understand what that takes, but what I want to get at is, you know, there's a posture here talking about the praying Christian, you know, aware of God, aware of what God does for us and what He's about. You know, we plant our request, here it is, in faith, but we must wait patiently for the timing of God's refreshing grace. It's not, we can't just say to ourselves, God, I want this answered by 7:30, you know, not 7:30 night, July 30th, I want it done by then. What do you think God's going to do? He's probably going to laugh at us. You know what I mean? Like, really? You think you can demand something like that? You know, and He's done that many times with those in the Bible. Said, I want this down. God's like, you ain't getting it now. You know, and we see that. So we understand that here, but we have to look at it. If we look at it from the sense of a farmer, it makes sense that patience, endurance, patience, that takes some time. Secondly, he goes a little further. He points about to the prophets. He points to the prophets, and he points to Job. Job is a great example. You know, we see the endurance and patience that is there. You know, these individuals, they prayed fervently, is what the Bible tells us. Not just prayed, they prayed fervently, yet they experienced, notice, prolonged periods of deep anguish and silence, not hearing from God. They dealt with that for some time. Job lost how much did Job lose? Basically everything. When it comes down to is what it tells us. Yet the story concludes with a demonstration that God ultimately compassionate and merciful towards Job and blessed him. Why did God bless Job so much? Because Job was what? Job was faithful. He was faithful to God. He didn't give in. He almost gave in. You know, he got really close, but he didn't. And you know, that was, you know, any of us in that situation with Job, that is hard for that Job did all that. Just remarkable of the man that he was. So as we see us here, you know, their lives, Job and the prophets, you know, that delayed answer are not a sign of divine abandonment. You know, a lot of times if we don't hear from God immediately or pretty quick in our time, we think it may be God abandoning us. God doesn't have time for us right then. It's never like that. God always has the time for us. It's a really, like you think about a canvas when you paint it. When it, you know, when you start seeing someone paint a canvas for a little while on a canvas, and you know, you're trying to figure out what it is, you're like, what is that? You know? And next thing they're done, and it's a beautiful painting. And you see what's there, and it's open, and that's the same thing. It takes developing time. Same with us. There is divine development that we see in God's Word, and that we find through prayer that we see here that James is talking about. But it doesn't end there. Here's the third one. James addresses our speech during the waiting periods. So here it is. There's waiting periods. So James lays it all out here. This is God basically telling you, this is how you pray, this is what you need to pray for, and this is how you need to wait. And that's what we see with it. See, he warns us not to grumble, you know, argue, you know, or basically just get upset, you know, about it like that, against one another and not make rash, manipulate oaths. That's what this oath means, where it says, notice where it says yes for yes and no for no. I've had some say, so you mean I can't take any oath at all? Is that what this is? He's saying, don't be, you know, don't be flippant about it. Don't be very just like, oh, no big deal, I'll just go ahead and make the oath. You think about that, I can't remember who it was, basically said, the next person that comes out, you may remember David, the next person that comes out my door, they'll die. I'll give them to the Lord. And it was his daughter. And I can't remember the name of the individual that was. You can't remember either. But when he did it, and he's like, oh, I made such a mistake.
It was one of the judges.
One of the what?
Was it one of the judges?
No, I don't think it was one of the judges. I don't remember. I'll recall it next week. I'll give it to everybody. Yeah, but I'm sure everybody recalls that situation. And we see that, you know, he was just like, he knew he made a mistake. Why? Because he jumped the gun. He made a rash, manipulative oath, basically, when you think about it. So, what's that? Jephthah. There we go. Good job. So Dave's doing this. He's going through that car catalog. He's going to find it. So because when we are, I would say for the younger ones, that's how we used to find our books, but nobody here is younger. All right. So because when we are, under pressure, our communication easily, guess what? It can corrupt us if we're under pressure. A lot of times we're under pressure, we say something what? Say something, we always say what we should, or sometimes we say something that we shouldn't. Without a doubt, we see that. So we can start complaining, to certain people, say, especially with brothers, sisters in Christ, and we maybe try to barter with God under desperate vows. God says that's not how it works. And so we have to be careful with that. James reminds us that the judge is standing at the door. That's what he says in that verse. The judge is standing at the door. True prayer requires an established heart that speaks certain ways. Check this out. That speaks simply. Don't you love that? Don't you love how God is a simple God? We've talked about before, the Bible was really written on a 6th grade education. When you look at it, even though some things are hard, you're like, what is that right there? But the ultimate of the book is written about on a 6th grade education. And so he wants us too to be like that, speak simply. Not that God doesn't understand everything, but it helps us, speak honestly. He also says about relying entirely, 100% on God's sovereignty without trying to force his hand through religious manipulation. How many people, we've said this before, how many people have been in that situation where they need God, and God, if you do this for me, I guarantee you I'm going to be better. I'm going to be the best Christian anywhere here on earth. But what happens after they get what they want? They head right back to where they were. Because that wasn't a true oath. And we see that, that's why he says, be very careful when you make these oaths. Be very careful of your timing. And so James makes that clear to us to understand those great points that are found there in it as we see. All right, let's go a little further. Then he talks about framework of corporate prayer. Corporate prayer would be everybody together. Praying in the worship, praying together for somebody that maybe needs prayers, just taking the time to do that. Let's go and read what it says, 13 through 15. If someone read it for us, please.
Is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing psalms. Is anyone among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church, and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise him up, and if he has sins, he will be forgiven.
Thank you. There's a lot going on right here in these verses. Having established, first of all, the context of patience that James does, and verbal integrity, basically, being very careful what we say, James arrives at the core, I guess you say, manual for prayer with the local church and the community. Well, he was just showing about private prayer. Now he's showing in a local sense, as we understand all together. Here, James, he builds kind of a comprehensive framework, kind of puts it all together, almost in an outline-like sense of really for the emotional and physical realities of life. Things that go on every day in our life, things that we deal with from time to time. He demonstrates that no matter what state a Christian finds themselves in, their primary outlet must be God-Word communication. Always. God-Word communication. If you're suffering, the remedy is, guess what? Personal prayer. Without a doubt, the Bible is very clear about it. Instead of venting to the world and sinking in despair, channel that emotional energy into direct dialogue with our Father. I've said before, maybe sometimes, we'll use social media to just kind of like, give everything, give all our laundry out there. We have to be careful with that. And what I mean by that is, if we're searching for help, it ain't going to come from there, but it will come from God. And that's what we see. As we think about this, if you are cheerful, the remedy is what? If you're a cheerful person, he said the remedy is praise. You should be happy, excited, living life as we see it in God. Singing psalms is simple. Singing psalms, he talks about that. Singing psalms or even songs is really, in a sense, simply prayer put to a musical thought, basically, as we would see. A joyful declaration of gratitude that keeps prosperity from turning into pride. Very important. We go, oh, I'm doing so good, and then I get prideful, like, I don't need God anymore. No, he said, we don't want to go that far. So what happens when we are too weak to pray for ourselves, this is where he goes to. He tells us that when we're physically sickness or spiritual exhaustion breaks your strength, James gives a practical command, let him call the elders of the church. And I want you to catch that. Notice that verse is very important. A lot of people don't read that right. Let him or her call the elders first, or call the elders of the church. In other words, this illuminates a critical vulnerability in the modern Christianity. Isolation, James assumes that every Christian is deeply embedded in a local, spiritual, meaning the church, where spiritual leaders are accessible. And we need to understand that it's not just the elders who we see. We can all be praying for other people. We see that. But the sick individual indicates the process. They do it by calling the elders. Not the elders searching them out. They do that if they need that help. And that's what the Bible is very clear, and it's always been like that. So the elders then come, anoint the individual with oil, which James was talking about in the first century, in the name of the Lord, and pray over them. Some people still today in the religious world still do that, but we go, why? What was the reason for the oil, as we would see here? The oil here was very, both, I guess you'd say, symbolic and practical weight in a sense. Knowing that in the ancient world, oil was used as a medicinal purpose. It was used for medical things. We see that with the Samaritan. Remember when the Samaritan's on the road, and the Good Samaritan and the person over there that the Samaritan finds, what does he use to heal him? Well, not heal him, but what does he use to take care of his wounds, it says? Oil. He put oil on him and then wrapped up his wounds. So as we see here, the scriptural side is that it represents the workings of Jesus. Back then it would have been, dealing with the Holy Spirit, as we see we understand with the apostles and so on. But in our sense today, it's dealing with Christ, what we find in the Word, what is there in it. So James boldly states that the prayer of faith, guess what he says will do? It will save the sick, and the Lord will raise him up. That's what he states during that time. Now, does that mean that everybody's gonna make it through a disease or whatever it means? What he's getting at, that may not always be, but this is what he is saying. Don't lose faith. Pray regardless. Pray regardless for those things, and make sure your things are to God. God may see the best thing for that person is to go and be with him, because of the suffering that they're going through, what's taking place here. God knows the answer. So we need to notice where the power lies. It does not say, notice, it does not say that the oil saves them. Doesn't say that at all. And it does not say the elders possess a magical healing touch. They touch them, whoo, they're healed. That's not what that is. It is the Lord who raises them up in response of prayer, notice, in faith. If your faith is not in your prayers, do you really expect them to work? Do we really expect them to take place, as we would want them to? Not at all. When we pray, we need to pray knowing that God's going to answer that prayer. Have faith in it as we see that. Now, like I'll say it again. Someone will say, well, he didn't answer that prayer exactly like I wanted. I gave him 10 things and he only gave me 9. Look, that's not what that is. God knows what we need, those 9 maybe. He knows you don't need that 10th one. Or maybe that 10th one will come later down the road. And we see that. So it's so important to see that. But furthermore, James even goes a little farther. He connects physical holiness, or wholeness, I would say, not holiness, wholeness complete, with spiritual restoration by adding, and if he has committed sins, what does it say there? He will be what? He will be forgiven. Now this is important to understand here as we look at this. God shows us it's not that those elders have the power to forgive a sin, because they don't. Nobody has that power. Even though there's a religion today that believes you can come to them and ask forgiveness, say your words, and they'll say you're forgiven, go do these things, and God will take care of you. No human being anywhere on this earth can forgive what we've done in sin-wise. Now, they can forgive you for something you've done towards them, but you still have to go to who to fix it? God. You have to go to God regardless. So what we see here, why does James say this then? Because what he says God is interested in is not just a physical restoration, but a complete restoration. Everything of the human being, the body, mind, and the spirit. Now, just because someone's in the state when they're hurting or something wrong doesn't mean that they've done something sinful at all. Sometimes it can be, but that's not what he's talking about here. He's just saying, make sure everything is right where you should be with God, which raises verses 16 and 18, where James goes a little bit further. He talks about confession and the power of the righteous. Now, here, this is so important. As we look at these verses, actually, just go ahead and read them. Let's reread them, then you'll see about this very familiar part about a righteous person, righteous man, it says, but man or woman, of course, this moment. If someone will read this for us, please.
Confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another
characterized by it's transparency. I would say like a radical transparency, very open, very able, everybody able to see what's going on. Because James says that in verse 16, by containing that foundational secret to spiritual breakthroughs. Now, I want to say it, a foundational secret. Now, is everybody here waiting? You're like, wait a minute, Ernie, what's the secret you're going to tell us? What's where's the secret there in that verse 16? I want to see it. It may not be the secret we're thinking about, because what he says is confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. In other words, what he's saying, sin thrives in secrecy. In other words, if we need help, if we need, it just seems like our prayers are not working on their own, what do we need to do? We need to ask others to pray for us. We need to ask others to be praying for us. Because when we have secrecy, when we keep it to ourselves, sin will thrive. It'll get stronger and stronger and stronger. That's why he makes this point. See, when we hide our faults, when we hide our failures and our addictions, we create a barrier not only between us and others, but it really hinders our spiritual vitality, our spiritual strength, our spiritual, growth that we see in it there. James takes this and he links this interpersonal confession with shared healing. And it's such a great and beautiful moment of what he speaks of here. Here it is. We do not confess to one another to receive forgiveness. I want you to get that. I don't confess to you, you don't confess to me to receive forgiveness like we talked about a moment ago that some religions teach. Only God can completely forgive, basically, sins fundamentally. But we confess to one another relationally, I guess you say, as a family of God, as a family of Christ, for accountability and healing support. That's why we do that. When someone comes forward to say, look, I just need help from the church, or maybe I've made this mistake, and it's public, and I need the church to know it, and I need to make things right. That's what it's talking about. But like I said, if anybody ever comes up here, first thing I ask them, have you prayed to God? Have you prayed to God on your own first? Have you prayed to God to forgive you? Because I can't forgive you. The church can't do that. It takes God to do it. But what they're doing in this moment is they're trying to show the church, look, I'm right with God again, or I need the help of the church to pray for me. And that's what we see James getting in this great moment. That's why he drops that statement that is echoed throughout time that we see here in the book of James, that the effective fervent prayers of a righteous man does what? Avails much. I mean, notice, it doesn't just say avails some. I mean, avails much. And so we see this. So the Greek word, this is a really interesting word again, effective or fervent, is a word called energio. I can barely say it. Energio. It's really, what does it sound like I'm saying? What do you hear that in English when I say energio? Energy, exactly right. That's where the word comes from. That's where we see that. As we understand, we get our word energy. It describes a prayer that is active, that is passionate, that is working, and that is filled, here it is, with divine life. Everything that's in it. It is not cold. It is not repetitive. It is not half-hearted. It is targeted and deeply felt. Now, he's not talking about like you're praying over a meal or something like that. Prayer over a meal, a lot of times you hear the same things in that prayer. Nothing wrong with that at all. He's talking about when we need help. He's talking about when we sin, when things are going wrong. He said, don't just do it like, hey, God, forgive me for what I did yesterday and go on about your life. Make sure you're very heartfelt about it. Remember, we're going before God to ask him to forgive us for what we've done. And, it needs to be more than just a nonchalant, just going by and say it real quick. That's not how it is. So as we think about this, to prove that this kind of prayer is accessible to ordinary people, some say, is it for everybody? Without a doubt, James highlights the prophet Elijah. Now, it would be easy for us to dismiss Elijah as a normal person, because we'd say he's more like a spiritual superhero, when we think about it, who operated on a plane that maybe we can never reach. Here's the difference. Elijah had the ability, yes, of doing certain things, of miracles and stuff like that, knowing what God had taught to him. But James intentionally demystifies him, intentionally says, he is no greater than you are. In other words, he is just a human being. Because look what he says there. Elijah was a man like a nature, of a nature like, guess whose? Ours. That's what he states in that verse. He had the same fears, same bouts of depression, same physical limitations, same human weaknesses that you and I face daily. Yet look at the result of his prayers. He prayed. Notice what it says. It didn't say he prayed and the rain stopped for 3 years. What kind of prayer did it say he prayed? He prayed what? What does it say up there? I heard it. Fervent prayer, prayed earnestly. Earnestly. Think about that for a moment. That earnestly, it's in it. And when he did it, the rain stopped. And when he prayed to God again, earnestly, guess what the rain did? Started back up. Now, does that mean you and I can control the rain? Well, I'll say this right now. We've got to get this. Elisha didn't control the rain either. Guess who controlled that rain? God did. And you know, we think about it, we go, is there nothing, how many of us, we just, you know, if it's dry, like we had dry for a little while, I mean, did any of us pray for rain? I guarantee I prayed for rain. I'm sure many others prayed for rain. And we're saying, well, it rains. Like, wow, okay, yeah, rain. Think about it for a moment. You prayed for it? Yeah. Did God answer that prayer? He definitely did. Did he hear your prayer? When someone said, oh, he didn't hear so-and-so's prayer. You know, he just did that. Don't say that. Without a doubt. Have faith in it that it's there, that we see that. So he finishes out in these last few areas here, verse 19 through 20, so I'm just about out of time. Rescuing the wandering. And the wandering, he's not talking about someone's lost on a trail, like you're thinking in this picture here, but lost on a trail of life. Lost on a trail of life means they're lost, they don't know how to get back to Christ, and they need to get there, and they need help. Someone go and read for us verses 19 through 20, please.
Brethren, if any among you wander from the truth, and someone turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save a soul from death and cover multiple sins.
I want you to really hear that verse for a moment. When we're baptized for remission of sins, we know who saves us. It's Christ. Christ saves us with that blood that was shed for us, Him hanging on that cross, being resurrected. But here's amazing. Just because you say, well, so-and-so baptized me, they saved me. No, they didn't. They were just the one that did the baptizing. You know, we see the Bible. The Bible is the one that encouraged you. The Bible is the one, you know, that really brought you where you need to be there with Jesus. And as we see this here, notice this part, though. Here is our part where we have the ability to do something and actually say later, I saved a soul. You know, and that's so true, because the Bible says, Ernie, we can't say that. That's a little prideful. No, but James says we can say that. James, and that should make us feel great. And once that's done, he's basically saying, hey, you should be to the point of feeling that you want to go do that for everybody that soul needs to be saved. That you see them bring them back to the Lord's church. Because that's what this is all about, is bringing people back and the intercessory prayer that is there. So I will say this, as we go through this life, I'm out of time now, as we go through this life, let us do everything that James told us in these 5 chapters. And let us understand that everything he received from him was inspired by God. And let us realize that all this chapter came to this point at the end. It's about prayer. And notice how James ends. James doesn't say goodbye. He doesn't do like this great, you know, ending and everything. He abruptly ends it. But his ending is this. He says where he says there, you know, turns a sinner from the error of his ways, will save the soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. What a way to end something. Well, what a way to show us that you and I are just as much involved, not in our own lives, but other people's lives, and how great it is that Christians can do that. Any questions or comments before we close? I was about to say I'm a minute over. I'm right at 10:45. Anybody else? Nope. All right, we're going in there. Appreciate your time.